Hello everyone, hope you all are doing well. Today we are back with the second part of the pioneers of Indian English literature, and we start with Mahatma Gandhi, the father of our nation. Mahatma Gandhi, the greatest leader our nation has beheld, wield the pen as a mirror, a prayer and a revolution. Gandhi's The Story of My Experiments with Truth and Hind Swaraj are his most important literary works. Born in 1869, Gandhi struggled with English, the language, in school, but life had different plans for him. In London and South Africa, he found his English voice, a voice for moral revolution. And then came his masterpiece, The Story of My Experiments with Truth, that came out in 1925. Serialized in Navjeevan, a Gujarati journal, and later translated by Mahadev Desai in Young India into English. More than an autobiography, it is a spiritual diary, a raw journey of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi from a shy boy to a nation's father. Gandhi was influenced by John Ruskin's critical essay on economics, Unto This Last. You remember the name, Unto This Last. He reimagined truth, self-responsibility and simplicity in a world obsessed with power. Writing became his tool for inner inquiry. Gandhi's political vision exploded in Hind Swaraj, that was published in 1909. A fierce critique of Western civilization, of mechanical progress, of blind industrialization. Hind Swaraj was banned by the British in 1910. Here Gandhi reflects Swaraj not just as the independence of the nation, but also talks about inner spiritual freedom. Gandhi's spirit rippled across literature. You can see Gandhian influence in other writers like R.K. Narayan's in his book Waiting for the Mahatma, B.R. Ambedkar's Mr. Gandhi and Emancipation of Untouchables, Bhabani Bhattacharya's Gandhi the Writer, Raja Rao's The Great Indian Way, N.K. Basu's My Days with Gandhi, etc. Gandhi showed that prose could be political, that truth could be revolutionary, that literature could be both a peaceful prayer and a protest at the same time. In Indian English writing, Gandhi became a moral horizon. Now let's talk about Sri Aurobindo. To appreciate Aurobindo's literary vision is to stand where literature, spirituality and nationalism meet. Sri Aurobindo's works like The Life Divine, The Synthesis of Yoga and essays on the Gita are crucial for the examination. Born in 1872, Aurobindo started his education at a Christian convent school in Darjeeling. Then he went to England and studied at the University of Cambridge, became a master of many European languages. A mind sharpened by the West, but a soul longing for India. He returned back in 1892. He worked in Baroda and Calcutta. But inside, a deeper revolution was brewing all this time, rediscovering Sanskrit, awakening Indian philosophy and practicing yoga intensely. His early writings like The Renaissance in India and The War and Self-Determination that came out in 1920 critiqued colonial domination, both political and cultural. In the Future Poetry, Letters on Poetry, Literature and Art that came between 1917 and 1920, he called for a new kind of poetry which is mantric and transformative. And then came the masterpiece, The Life Divine, his principal philosophical work that came between 1914 and 1919. He drew from Vedanta, Sankhya Darshan and Western metaphysics in this book. The work envisioned spiritual evolution. Okay, it discussed how to walk the path towards a spiritual life. Now, The Synthesis of Yoga that came out in 1948. It showed the way to use yoga for the betterment of life itself. Earlier, in the Essays of Gita, 1922, he reinterpreted the Gita, not as renunciation, but as a fearless spiritual action. In The Mother, a series of inspirational essays that came out in 1928, he revealed the power of divine Shakti, the force behind all creation and change. Together, these works placed Aurobindo as philosopher, poet, yogi, and nation builder. He dreamt of a new humanity. If Aurobindo's prose carved the path, his poetry and drama gave it wings. Works like Savitri, The Golden Light, and Persuades the Deliverer are important for the UGC NET examination, okay? Now, Aurobindo's poetry is called overhead poetry. Not from the rational mind, it was written from a higher mind or an illumined mind or intuition or overmind. At the center stands Savitri, a legend and the symbol, 1950. It was written in blank verse over nearly 50 years. Savitri retells the story of Mahabharata, having the characters Satyavan and Savitri as a cosmic spiritual battle against death. Its cosmology, psychology, mysticism together combined into one work. Other luminous poems include The Golden Light. It was a radiant sonnet series. Then The Rose of God, a lyrical call for divine transformation. Then came collected poems and plays in 1942, which brought his poetic treasures together. And The Hour of God that came out in 1959. It offered mystical reflections on his philosophy. But Aurobindo also loved writing drama. Perseus the Deliverer was a Greek myth reimagined. Okay, Vasavadatta, Rodaguna, etc. are romantic tales of love and sacrifice. Eric was inspired by Nordic legends. The Viziers of Basora was a light magical comedy from him. Many plays were unpublished during his lifetime. Disciples later unveiled them. Later, Aurobindo withdrew into seclusion towards the last stage of his life, and he founded the Sri Aurobindo Ashram in 1926. The mother, Mira Alfasa, his collaborator, continued the vision. Posthumous works expanded his dream, like The Ideal of Human Unity that came out in 1950 about global governance with spiritual foundations. The Human Cycle that came out in 1949, tracing humanity's psychological evolution. His biographer Ambulal Purani captured his life in The Life of Sri Aurobindo, Evening Talks with Sri Aurobindo, etc. Aurobindo gave us a vision where spirit, art and society rise together, and through him Indian English literature touched the stars. You might wonder, Sri Aurobindo wrote so much, how can we remember it all for UGC NET examination? Here is the truth. You don't have to remember everything like we say. You don't have to panic about exact publication dates, because there is a hidden problem. Most of Aurobindo's works first came in installments, especially through Arya Journal and all, and then they were published much later as collections. Even in the recent UGC NET examinations, the questions about Aurobindo's publication years were of full confusion. So different books give slightly different timelines, and if you trust random internet sources, you can go wrong. So you could stick to our structured list based on careful research. Like always, we use our first, middle, end formula to remember it easily. So the first anchor here being Songs to Mithila, 1895. It was his early poetry. Then there is the middle anchor, The Life Divine, that came out from 1914 to 1919. It was a volume published in 1939. It was a spiritual treatise. The end anchor is The Viziers of Basora, the romantic comedy play that was published posthumously in 1959. Now, the code we have formed for you is this. Songs of Urvashi in the Bhavani Mandir offers her future poetry to the mother with the Rose of God. So it combines all his works like Songs of Mithila, 1895, the poetry, Urvashi, 1896, the play, Bhavani Mandir, 1905, the nationalistic pamphlet, the future poetry, 1917 to 1920, it was a literary criticism, The Mother, the spiritual essay that came out in 1928. Then there is Rose of God, the mystical lyric poem that came out in 1934. Now, the second code is The Life of Divine Golden Children Doing Yoga with Teacher Savitri also teaches on the Veda and the Hour of God. So, it combines the Life Divine from 1914 to 19, the philosophy, the middle work, the Golden Light, the mystical sonnet, the Children of Wotan, the dramatic poem, the synthesis of yoga, the spiritual treatise, Savitri, a legend and a symbol, epic poetry on the Veda, published in 1956 about Vedic studies, and the Hour of God, compiled literature that came out in 1959. So it was a meditative prose. The final anchor is the last work, The Viziers of Basora, published in 1959. a romantic comedy based on Arabian tales. So that is Aurobindo for you. Now let's move on to Sarojini Naidu, the Nightingale of India. Sarojini Naidu, the renowned and much celebrated Nightingale of India, had her spirit singing for India's freedom and its beauty. Sarojini Naidu's poems like The Bangle Sellers, Indian Weavers, and Palanquin Bearers are often asked in the examination. She was born in 1879. She was raised in Hyderabad. She lived two big dreams, beauty and liberation. She was the first Indian woman to preside over the Indian National Congress, later the first woman governor of Uttar Pradesh. Early on, the British poet Arthur Symons praised her musical romantic poetry. Today, her birthday is celebrated as National Women's Day, a tribute to her pen and her power. Her poetry is pure melody. The Golden Threshold, her collection that came out in 1905, brought Indian life and tenderness into lyrical English. Followed by The Bird of Time in 1912, it was a song of love, longing, and strength. Then came The Broken Wing in 1917. It was poems. They were a collection of poems on loss, hope, and endurance. Later, The Sceptred Flute that came out in 1943 gathered her major works. Posthumous gems like The Feather of the Dawn 1961 and The Indian Weavers 1971 also shows her political genius. Her poems celebrate Indian traditions, women's lives, and nature's beauty. The poems like The Indian Weavers, weaving life's journey into clothes. The Bangle Sellers, celebrating a woman's life stages through colors. Palanquin Bearers, carrying joy and sorrow with songs. These are the favorites for UGC NET examiners. In other poems like The Queen's Rival, she explores Persian legends and motherly tenderness. In Bird Sanctuary, she dreams of being a wounded bird, finding refuge. In Indian Dancers, she captures grace, rhythm, and the beauty of Indian art. In poems like Coromandel Fisher's Parda Nashin, the Temple, A Pilgrimage of Love, she weaves themes of strength, nature, and soul's prayers. In every line, Sarojini Naidu blended romantic lyricism with Indian spirit. She showed the world that India could sing in English with an Indian soul. She remains a voice of beauty, resilience, and luminous hope. Now let's learn how to easily remember the works of Sarojini Naidu for our exam. And the good news is this time it's really easy. Poems like The Bird Sanctuary, Palanquin Bearers, Coromandel Fishers, and The Indian Weavers very frequently asked in the exam. So we use the same method, first, middle, end. Now, simple story chord, The First Anchor, The Golden Threshold, 1905, her first poetry collection. Middle anchor, the Bird of Time, The Broken Wing, The Sceptred Flute, The Feather of the Dawn. Now, the end anchor is The Indian Weavers, 1971, the last posthumous poetry collection. So here is the code. At the bird sanctuary near the Palanquin Pond, I saw the bird of time who had a broken wing because it was trying to catch coromandel fishers in silence, but its feather got tangled at the Indian Weavers. After Sarojini Naidu, we move on to Rabindranath Tagore, a mystic voice in Indian English poetry and drama. If poetry, music, theatre and mysticism lived inside one soul, it would be Rabindranath Tagore. Works like The Feast of Youth, Blood of Stones, Siddhartha, Man of Peace are important for our exam. Born in 1898, he was the younger brother of Sarojini Naidu. But he carved his own destiny and identity as a writer, being a poet, dramatist, actor, musician, and seeker of spiritual truth. At 19, he stunned the literary world with his poetry collection, The Feast of Youth. It came out in 1918. It was a celebration of spirit, youth as the endless possibility. Followed by this, the poem The Magic Tree, which came out in 1922, talked about the myths and spiritual energy blooming together. He soon entered drama with the work called Abu Hassan that came out in 1918. It was the early playful storytelling kind of a work. Now, then came a collection called The Five Plays in 1937, capturing Indian folklore and myths. As India changed, so did his writing style. During the stormy 1940s, he wrote Blood of Stones, that came out in 1944. It was a poetry collection on suffering and resilience. Later came Spring in Winter, 1955, another poetry of hope reborn. Now, Siddhartha, Man of Peace, very important, came out in 1956. It was a verse drama on Buddha's life. His works danced between the earth and the eternal. The poem Virgin and Vineyards that came out in 1967 explored divine union and inner transformation. Some other unforgettable poems include The Map of the World about cosmic vision, The Cow about sacred simplicity, The Poet and the Children about how innocence meets wonder, then The Hour of Rest about peaceful surrender, Sufi worship about mystical devotion, Voyage about a young boy's imagination on fleeting on a paper boat. And in his play Jayadeva, he honored India's classical literary soul. Through poems, plays and music, Harindranath laid a passage from ancient India to the modern world, carrying the divine spirit hidden in every human heart. Harindranath Chattopadhyaya was a mystic poet, dramatist. Above all, he was a soul always searching for light, we can say. Our next writer is S. Radhakrishnan, the interpreter of Indian philosophy for the West in the world of ideas. Some thinkers build bridges wide enough to connect civilizations. Dr. S. Radhakrishnan, who lived between 1888 and 1975, was one such personality. His works like Indian Philosophy, Volume 1 and 2, The Hindu View of Life, Eastern Religions and Western Thought are very important for UGC NET exam. Born with a very sharp mind and a spiritual heart, Radhakrishnan rose to become a philosopher, a statesman, and became India's second president. But long before that, he was a master interpreter of Indian thought for the West. His monumental work, Indian Philosophy, the volume 1 came in 1923 and the second volume came in 1927. It explained Hindu thought rigorously, clearly and faithfully. It was the first time an insider telling India's story globally and not through colonial distortion. He followed it with some other powerful works like The Hindu View of Life that came out in 1926 about India's spiritual heartbeat. Then came An Idealist View of Life in 1929, merging idealism with Indian wisdom. He also wrote Eastern Religions and Western Thought. It came out in 1939, bridging East and the West. Then Religion and Society in 1947, linking spirituality and social ethics. In the work Kalki, or The Future of Civilization, that came out in the year 1929, he warned against mechanization and loss of human values. Through brilliant translations of Bhagavad Gita, Dhammapada, and Principal Upanishads, Brahma Sutras, etc., he made sacred wisdom and Indian philosophy available for the whole world. He restored India's spiritual voice on the world stage. Through him, India arose as a civilization of timeless wisdom, not just another British colony. Today, when we study Indian English prose, we could see how Radhakrishnan bridged the ancient soul of India to the future of humanity. Now comes another giant, Jawaharlal Nehru, the architect of Indian political prose and cultural historiography. In the grand story of India's freedom struggle, the visionary leadership and unwavering voice of Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister, was inevitable. He lived between 1889 and 1964. Works like Glimpses of the World History, Discovery of India, and Autobiography, etc. are unforgettable. Now, Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, as we already mentioned, along with being one of the greatest nation builders, was a master of prose, weaving history, philosophy, and personal philosophy together. Okay? Now, he was educated at Cambridge in Natural Sciences. He was trained in law in London, and Nehru's English carried an Edwardian grace, we can say. But his spirit beat for free India, always. Now, Glimpses of World History 1934. It was written entirely from prison. It compiled 196 letters to his daughter Indira Gandhi, telling the story of the world civilization from 6000 BC onwards. This wasn't Eurocentric history. It was the world through an Indian's eyes, we can say. Now, then an autobiography came out in the year 1936. It was first titled In and Out of Prison. Later it was subtitled Toward Freedom. All these are important, you should remember. A deep personal meditation on civil disobedience and awakening. Now, the crown jewel, the discovery of India, that came out in the year 1946. It was written during the imprisonment after Quit India movement, and was a passionate tracing of India's cultural and political soul. Even in simpler writings, Nehru shined, like in the letters from father to his daughter, 1928. He wrote beautiful guiding lessons to young Indira, which was later translated into Hindi by Munshi Premchand. That detail is also very important. Now, through all his writings, Nehru merged private reflection with national consciousness. He made politics personal. He made history human. Today, the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library in New Delhi embodies his lasting literary legacy and national pride. Through his prose, Jawaharlal Nehru discovered India and reimagined it for a new world. The last writer of our today's session is Nirartsi Chowdhury, the contrarian chronicler of Indian and imperial cultures. In a time when nationalism was sweeping India, there stood a fierce man who refused to sway. His works like The Autobiography of an Unknown Indian, A Passage to England, The Continent of Circe often appears in UGC NET question papers. Now, Nirartsi Chowdhury, who lived between 1897 and 1999, was a Bengali scholar, essayist and a cultural provocator. Now, born with a love for Shakespeare and Sanskrit, he admired British liberal values. Even when most Indians were fighting colonialism, he was supporting the British liberal values, like we mentioned, and he had to pay the price, being branded as the last British imperialist. Chowdhury chose truth over popularity. And his first major strike would be The Intellectual in India, that came out in 1967. It was a brutal critique of India's intellectual decline. But even before that, he stirred waves with his book A Passage to England. 1959, describing England with devotion and critiquing India's rejection of colonial modernity. His book of essays, The Continent of Circe, came out in 1965. Then came To Live or Not to Live in 1971. Chowdhury continued his fearless critique and examination of India's contradictions through his greatest and most controversial work, The Autobiography of an Unknown Indian. Remember the year that it came out, 1951. It was a memoir, at the same time a cultural and intellectual history. And it opened with the line that shocked the nation, to the memory of the British Empire in India. It cost him everything, his job, his pension, his place in Indian literary circles, etc. Everything we can say. But Chowdhury stood firm, unapologetic, elegant and unyielding. In The Objective Method in History, his another book, it was later included in the New Oxford Book of English Prose that came out in 1998. He sealed his place internationally. For Chowdhury, autobiography was about cultural diagnosis. Love him or hate him, you cannot ignore him. Some writers are loved, some are hated. Only a few are unforgettable. Nirartsi Chowdhury, he made sure he belonged among the third one. Works like The Autobiography of an Unknown Indian cannot be forgotten. Thy Hand, Great Anarch, that came out in 1987, was an autobiographical sequel to the above work, and the title was inspired by Pope's Dunciad. It was wrote in his 80s, told his own journey from government clerk to a literary rebel. After Autobiography of an Unknown Indian, Chowdhury travelled and wrote A Passage to England and came out in the year 1959. Here he reversed E.M. Foster's Passage to India, celebrating England's order and civility. While others wrote about India's wounds during the colonial rule, Chowdhury wrote about its wonders. He joked that climate, not race, turned Englishmen cruel in India. This idea grew in The Continent of Circe that came out in 1965 as well. Now, comparing India to Circe's island from Homer's Odyssey, it was a satirical work. Now, his critiques continued in The Intellectual in India, a scathing essay collection that came out in 1967, Scholar Extraordinary, 1974, another brilliant biography of Max Muller, British philologist and Orientalist. Now, Culture in the Vanity Bag, 1976, biting satire on post-colonial India. Even at 100 years old, he continued writing. His last work being Three Horsemen of the New Apocalypse that came out in 1997. It offered his final reflections on civilization's decline. Through it all, Chowdhury taught this lesson. Dissent is sometimes the truest patriotism. He made autobiography into cultural history, travel writing into philosophy, satire into civilization's last cry. So here is the list of Nirad Chowdhury's all works, okay, once again. And let's fix the first work being The Autobiography of an Unknown Indian, came out in 1951, and the last one being Three Horsemen of the New Apocalypse, 1997. Now let's go into the code. An unknown Indian takes a passage to England, travels through the continent of Circe, questions the intellectuals in India about whether to live or not to live, meets the scholar extraordinary, peeks into the culture in the vanity bag, surrenders his fate to the hand of the great anarch, and finally watches the three horsemen ride across the new apocalypse. So that way you can remember all of Nirad Chowdhury's works in chronological order. I hope this helps you, and you can make your own codes like this to remember. If this is not helping you, this is just a suggestion from our side that this is it's an easy way that you can remember all his works, all the works of other writers also. We offer codes like this for all the major authors. Okay, I hope this session was useful for you. Now we'll come with yet another session on Indian literature. Thank you. Have a good time.